Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson. When people talk about basketball in the 80s and 90s, these are the names that immediately come to mind for most. The three stars who turned around the fate of the NBA and made it the global game it is today. What did all three of these stars have in common? They were great players on great teams, with particularly great second options. Jordan had Pippen, Bird had McHale and Parrish, and Magic of course had Kareem, who was still putting up great numbers all throughout his 30s. Now what if there was a diminutive point guard who had a great team, but not the quality of second options like the previously mentioned players, and he would have beaten not one, not two, but all three of these players on his way to winning 2 consecutive championships that would have been 3 if it weren't for a phantom foul call that robbed Detroit of a 3rd championship. What if this point guard was an all-star for 12 consecutive seasons? What if he averaged over 20 points and 10 assists for 4 consecutive seasons? With a season in which he averaged over 20 points and a touch under 14 assists per game, would he deserve to be mentioned in this conversation? Yes, he would. But does he? No, he does not. Isiah Thomas is one of the most underappreciated players of all time. Now, there's a distinction here, because I think generally he is seen as one of the greats, although you could definitely argue for him being both underrated and underappreciated, but he is most definitely underappreciated. I mean, you said it best, Scottie Pippen.
Don't nobody know who he is anyway. So
I got you. What
am I going to say?
You're right, Scottie. The 6'1" point guard who was the driving force behind the beatdowns that your Bulls team received was a nobody. The man that dropped 25 points on one leg in a quarter against a dynastic Lakers team was a nobody. The finals MVP, the 3rd best point guard of all time, was a nobody. Now I'm going to save my breath and not compare Isiah Thomas to Scottie Pippen, because anyone with a functioning brain can work out who the better player of the two is. In order to understand the greatness of Isiah Thomas, we need to understand his resume. Now, we aren't going all the way back to when he first picked up a basketball as a 3-year-old in Chicago. Let's go back to his college career, where Thomas would lead Indiana to the NCAA championship in only his 2nd season on the back of 16 points, 6 assists per game, and over 2 steals, picking up the NCAA's most outstanding Final Four player on the way. Now, what would Thomas do after being drafted to the Detroit Pistons in his first year in the NBA? He would come into the league as a 20-year-old and average 17 points per game, a touch under 8 assists per game, and over 2 steals per game. Now, Thomas wouldn't just make the Eastern Conference All-Star team. He would start for the Eastern Conference team as a 20-year-old rookie, the 1983-84 season. After hiring legendary coach Chuck Daly and trading for center Bill Laimbeer the year prior, the Pistons would improve their record from 37-45 to 49-33, finishing as the 4th seed in the Eastern Conference. Isiah would go on to win the All-Star Game MVP this season. During a period of time in which the All-Star Game was competitive, he put up a light 21 points, 15 assists, and 5 steals, en route to leading the Eastern Conference to a 154-145 win over the Western Conference. The Pistons would lose in 5 games to the 5th seed Knicks, despite Isiah putting up 21.5 points, 11 assists, and 2.5 steals per game over the 5 games, including a Game 5 performance in which he scored 35 points, with 16 of these 35 points coming in not just the last quarter, the last 2 minutes of the 4th. Trailing by 8, Isiah scored 16 consecutive points for the Pistons, bringing the game to overtime. Now watch as Isiah hits a 3 from deep, before shredding the Knicks defense on multiple plays using his speed, agility, and ball handling to get to the rim and finish. With 24 seconds remaining, Isiah would walk into a pull-up 3 and tie the game, sending fans into a frenzy. Unfortunately, the Pistons and Thomas would then cool off in overtime and lose the game and series to the Knicks, despite one of the greatest displays of scoring in history by a 22-year-old Isiah Thomas throughout those last 2 minutes of the 4th quarter. Over the next 3 seasons, the Pistons would win their first playoff series in 10 years, defeating the Nets on the back of Isiah's 22 points and 12 assists on 54% shooting. The Pistons would then fall short to Bird and the Celtics, despite Thomas averaging 25.5 points per game, a touch under 11 assists, while shooting 48% from the field, with Thomas also leading the series in steals, averaging over half a steal a game, more than the next best, the Celtics' Dennis Johnson. However, despite the acquisition of Dumars, the Pistons would finish the following season with the same record and lose in 4 games to the Hawks. Isiah would put up pretty average stats, finishing the series with a light 26.5 points per game, 12 assists, and over 2 steals yet again. Thomas would also go on to win his 2nd All-Star Game MVP in 3 years on the back of a 30-point, 10 assists, and 5 steal performance, carrying the Eastern Conference to a win over the Western Conference. Oh, and if you're wondering during the course of this 3-year period what Thomas's regular season stats looked like, they read something like 20.9 points per game, 11.6 assists, and over 2 steals per game, while shooting 47% from the field. Now, these stats are all very impressive, but many people would argue they count for little if they don't result in your team winning some playoff series, and more importantly some NBA championships, which is why Isiah Thomas cemented himself as one of the top 20 players of all time and the third best point guard of all time during the next 5 seasons. The 1987 season saw the Pistons advance to their first Eastern Conference Finals in decades, following wins over the Bullets and Hawks before failing to beat the Celtics, with the defining moment an uncharacteristic mistake from Zeke that gave the Celtics a 3-2 lead and saw the Celtics eventually win. Zeke would average 24 points, a touch under 9 assists, and 2.5 steals per game throughout these playoffs, but was ultimately disappointed with the eventual result. This led to the 1988 season. Isiah would lead his Pistons past Jordan and the Bulls this season on the back of 20 points and 10 assists. In the following series, he would put on a show against Bird and the Celtics, putting up 35 points in the crucial Game 1 and 35 in Game 5 with the series tied, averaging characteristically great numbers, leading his team to their first finals series in over 30 years. But the legend of Isiah Thomas really grew when Thomas came up against his old friend Magic Johnson and the LA Lakers in the finals of the 1988 NBA season. June 19, 1988, the Pistons have a 3-2 lead over the LA Lakers. Isiah Thomas enters the game with a banged up ankle. It was so bad that Chuck Daly didn't expect the star would be able to play at all, but he did, and he would battle through the first half before injuring that exact ankle again, which looked like it would result in the end of his night, but how far from the truth that turned out to be. With almost no ability to put any sort of pressure on his right ankle, Isiah wouldn't just battle throughout the remainder of the game, he would dominate, putting up 25 points on a busted ankle in the third quarter of the NBA Finals. Undoubtedly, unquestionably, the greatest performance of all time in a single quarter. With no mobility in his right ankle, limping uncontrollably, Thomas was so determined to will his team to their first finals win, he could not be stopped. With jump shot after jump shot and reckless drives to the rim, Thomas was unstoppable, and it looked as if it had paid off, with the Pistons leading late in the game 102-101, before Bill Laimbeer was called for an inconceivable foul that resulted in a Lakers Game 6 win and a Lakers series win, following some more very dodgy officiating. Now you have to understand, Isiah Thomas did not just lose out on a championship, he lost out on a finals MVP, and his heroic performance was overshadowed because of the eventual loss. Yet we must still recognise the performances that he gave throughout the 1988 playoffs, particularly in Game 6 of the NBA Finals. Following a loss in the NBA Finals for very controversial reasons, to go along with an injured ankle, Thomas could have been excused for having a down year, but he continued to lead his Pistons team and did so very effectively, resulting in a 63-win season on the back of over 19 points and 8 assists per game during the regular season, before defeating Bird's Celtics, Jordan's Bulls, and then Magic's Lakers, while averaging 18 points and 8 assists throughout, including 21 points and 7 assists in the finals, losing out on the finals MVP to Joe Dumars, who had a terrific finals series. This resulting in the Pistons' first championship and Isiah Thomas's first championship as a Piston. The Pistons then rolled on to another final series, following a victory over Jordan's Bulls for the third consecutive season, in which Thomas top scored in 3 of the 7 games, more than any other player including Michael Jordan. Following victory over Jordan and the Bulls, the Trailblazers had no answers for Thomas, as he averaged over 27 points per game on over 54% from the field, while helping his teammates to buckets on 7 occasions, resulting in his first finals MVP and the Pistons' second consecutive championship. Now, the following season saw the Pistons team grow old and separate as Thomas struggled with injuries of his own. With an awful wrist injury to go along with a few other niggles, Thomas never returned to his scintillating best, and as a result the Pistons were no match for MJ and the Bulls as they were swept. Isiah Thomas is a 6'1" point guard who led his team to 5 consecutive conference finals, 3 consecutive finals, and 2 consecutive championships that quite frankly should have been 3. He gave you 20 and 10 throughout his regular season career, and then elevated that throughout the playoffs, going up against the likes of Jordan, Bird, and Magic. Thomas had a 55% win record against Michael Jordan and the Bulls. He was the catalyst behind beating Bird's Celtics, and was a major factor in beating Magic and the Lakers. Isiah Thomas is a top 20 NBA player of all time and deserves to be mentioned in the same sentence as MJ, Bird, and Magic because he was just that good. Isiah Thomas is the most underappreciated player of all time, and that's why.